So Maze, welcome and thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for taking time out to join us.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to join you.
So I wanted to share with you that I've been reading a lot of the work you've published in Inside Higher Ed. I was also really lucky to attend a webinar that you did this summer as I was thinking about remote learning at Rutgers more broadly and also in my own classes, and particularly as it pertains to the challenges of teaching in the art history classroom, where we have lots of visceral images, sometimes complicated, difficult histories. And the way that you were framing trauma-informed pedagogy was really a revelation to myself, and I know to many others. And during one of your webinars, you framed a question that really spoke to me when you said, how do we teach to the lonely, the broken, and the fearful? And that was exactly what my experience was in the spring when we all moved to remote. And at that time, I'm trying to lead my students in conversations of particularly challenging images from difficult histories. And I know that you had been studying in really remarkable ways the stress levels of your students themselves. And so I was wondering if you could get our series started and our conversation started with a clinical definition of trauma and what exactly trauma-informed pedagogy is, how we could be thinking about this when we're structuring our classes in the spring.
Thank you. So those are great questions, and thank you for your kind comments. So I want to begin, there are various definitions when it comes to trauma. And they all center around our ability to do something about a situation that we are presented with. So you could define trauma as any negative or adverse event that we experience that makes us feel fearful and helpless about the situation. So it feels like a threat to life, whether it is or not, that's a different story, but feels to us that way. So leading psychiatrist and researcher Bessel van der Kolk talks about trauma or traumatic stress as he says that it's at the core of that trauma or traumatic stress, there is a breakdown in our ability to regulate our internal state. That internal state, whether it is fear, anger, anxiety, lack of control. And so what will happen? The body, the mind is going to continue to spend energy trying to regulate that, but it can't. And so because of that, it feels exhausting. It feels overwhelming. It feels threatening to life. So, and so one might ask, wait a second, why is the brain so concerned with that? The brain is concerned, or one could say that our physiology is concerned with keeping us alive. And so the brain is constantly scanning the environment without even us knowing. And it's sampling information to make predictions about our safety, about our survivability. When I face a situation that feels threatening, the brain asks the question, what can I do to ensure my well-being? And sometimes the brain is going to ask the question, what can I do to ensure my family, my community's well-being? When we can't answer the question, when we're uncertain, when we don't have the control, then we experience that traumatic stress. Our alarm system, the fight or flight goes on. And when that system, that alarm system remains active, it is traumatic. Now, when it comes to trauma-informed care, whether it is education or healthcare or management, what we're talking about is it's a recognition that trauma is pervasive, that trauma is individual, that trauma could be activated by a single event, such as a car accident or a fight you have with your partner. It could also be activated by recurring events over one generation, such as somebody who's experienced and experiencing poverty or racism. And it could even be intergenerational. And that intergenerational is something that is, for example, racial violence, the silence about racial violence. That could all be traumatic. So what happened in 2020, what is happening in 2020 is we were presented with a host of profound ingredients for trauma: unpredictability, uncertainty, lack of control, the isolation. Those are all traumatic ingredients. And so we could take for granted the fact that we were dealing with a lot of trauma, individually and also collectively. I, as a teacher, keep that in mind as I move forward to work with my students or to work with my colleagues, because I recognize that the brain right now is more concerned with answering the question of what can I do about this, right?
And I mean, I appreciate the way that you were kind of unpacking the different ways that we could think about trauma. And I think we could have and maybe should have had this conversation way before 2020 and thinking about a trauma-informed lens in all of our interactions with our students. I think about this a lot, particularly when I'm showing imagery that could be triggering, that is violent, that shows violence towards women, among many other things. And how, when we think about trauma as something that could be an individual experience, right now, I think it's coming to the fore because it's this collective experience, but it's also exacerbating all of these individual experiences of trauma that we as educators are likely encountering, but are not aware of. And so I think having this lens for forever is good, but I think right now could not be any more timely or necessary, because these are compounded, if I'm understanding you correctly.
And that's a great comment, that we should have been having these conversations before 2020, because our students, a lot of our colleagues, were dealing with a host of adversities before 2020.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, from mental health to poverty to racial violence, our students were coming to us carrying all of that. And then we, in turn, we're in the front line with students. We see them struggle. We see their adversities. We're witnessing it. So then we start absorbing that as a phenomena called secondary traumatic stress. So really, if we're honest with ourselves, it is important to recognize that in higher ed, we did not prioritize care when it came to our students and our colleagues. And so I would say that one of the, if you will, the silver lining of this pandemic is that we're being, in a way, forced to pause and say, how can we move forward? What can we do to provide a bridge for our students to move from this disruptive present to a future where they can be hopeful and confident and empowered to heal and thrive?
And I think this is really important. It's important for all educators, but also those of us in the arts. This is the community that you're speaking to. I think we also might have a special place there in thinking about collective viewing or looking together at objects, creating new works of art. And so I'd like to maybe follow up on that thread a little bit later as well, because I think that's a really beautiful point that complements our conversations that are heavy and challenging around trauma as well.
Yeah.
I'm wondering too, because I'm sure that other people have asked you this. I'm sure you're thinking about this. This is something that I struggled with in my own courses, is that, okay, I want to be aware of my students' individual traumas without crossing any kind of boundaries, right? I don't actually want to be aware of the details of their individual traumas. I'm not a counselor. Yet at the same time, I was faced with, as many of us were, with this unprecedented moment of collective trauma. And having these courses meet remotely now, I felt as an educator that I did not have the tools to be able to identify when students were particularly struggling with trauma. And I was wondering if you could outline for us maybe some of the warning signs or signs that we should be aware of in our courses in terms of interactions with our students, or when we might need to make some interventions, or how we should be aware of our students' behavior and how it's tied to this period of trauma.
Yeah. So it's really important when it comes to trauma and trauma informed, we want to make sure we don't trigger or re-traumatize. One way is not to make assumptions about the persons we're working with. Why? If someone makes assumptions about you, your brain, you may not even be aware that your brain is going to do that, but your brain is going to ask, do they not care what I think? How do they know? How can they make assumptions about me? And that can rob us of our sense of safety. So really important not to make assumptions. So I would never say, oh, you're traumatized. Oh, but I will take for granted the fact that what happened in 2020 is, like I said, presented us with profound ingredients of trauma and traumatic stress. So I take for granted that to various degrees, we are all experiencing traumatic stress. Okay, I'm going to work from that perspective. When I use a trauma-informed lens says what? That trauma impacts the way we interact, we connect, we engage, we learn, we thrive, our entire well-being. And it's pervasive, it is insidious. I don't need to know who has it and who doesn't. I don't need to be a therapist. We're not diagnosing, we're not treating. A trauma-informed lens is about providing the safety, not just the physical, the emotional, the social, psychological, the safety, and cultivating connections and empowering the students, the individuals. And so I'm going to include, what if one of my learning objectives in the course is, how can I help the students believe, trust that I have their back, that I am on their side, that this is a journey of us together, that this is not about competition and failing and marginalizing. And so safety becomes really critical. You are welcome in this space, all of you, your whole self. And also I'm going to help build connections and relationships between me and my student, but also among ourselves. Now, we are going to encounter students who are experiencing severe traumatic stress. What are some of the things I pay attention to? I pay attention to irritability. Does the student feel irritable? Does the student feel, or does it seem that they are disengaged? Does it seem that they are not really putting an effort into an assignment. So instead of using the language of, oh, they don't come, they're not doing their work, those are all perhaps happening, I'm going to use the language of, they're not turning on their camera. I wonder if it's too stressful. I wonder if turning on the camera and looking at their image is triggering something, right? They don't seem to put full effort into the assignment. I wonder if they understand why the assignment is important. I mean, when we're experiencing trauma, when we're under the influence of all these negative stressors, the brain becomes hijacked by those emotions. And energetically speaking, the brain says, who cares about doing this assignment? I need to figure out how I'm going to answer the question of what can I do to stay alive? What can I do to maintain my well-being? And so what I started doing over the years is, for example, when a student leaves an exam empty and leaves the classroom, the first time it happened, I thought, I can't believe them. I can't believe they don't value, they don't respect the process. And I, came to my senses and I thought, what's going on here? I know the student knows the answer. What's happening? And as a matter of fact, in one case, I ran out after the student and I said, come back. I know you know this. We talked about this. And the student said, I can't. And we actually, I did a focus group. I investigated. The student froze. Now, what happens when we freeze? The brain says, I cannot exert any more energy on this task. I am depleted. I am going to, for my well-being, stop. So it's really being in tune with the student. Or another example I'll give you is a student that I was doing a lecture, is in the classroom, and I wrote something on the board. I turned and I saw a student who was sitting in the front row, and the student was crying, and to the point that I didn't want to wait. I said, "What's going on? What's happening?" And the student said, "This is so much information.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do. We're going to need to know all of this." And I recognized that her brain was overwhelmed by the speed and the amount of content, right? Now, when I talked with the students, I learned that what happened to her throughout her schooling is people always said to her, "You're so slow, you're so slow." So that has become a traumatic thing for her. So again, it's to I hope I answered your question. It's really to be in tune with the student, when we see a reaction or lack thereof, we, instead of diagnosing, oh, it's because of this and that, we wonder, what stress are they experiencing that's putting a block to them engaging or learning.
Maze, this is so thank you for your response, which has a lot of wonderful information. But a few of the things that are really sticking with me is, one, this idea of a community in your classroom and engaging with your students as equal members of that community. Part of that community, I think, also is tied to transparency. I love the way you phrase, do you understand why I'm giving you this assignment? Do you understand why I'm giving you this prompt? Do you, and not in a way that's pedantic, but in a way that is, I really want you to understand this is actually for your development in this course. And I think that that's such a useful takeaway for all of us, no matter what we are teaching. But some of the other things that you raised, actually, I think have a lot of resonance with the art history classroom. We have timed exams. They're often in the dark when we're in the brick and mortar. There's lights being projected. I think about how that not necessarily conversation around trauma, but is a stressful, stress-inducing, anxiety-inducing space. And I know many students felt the same way when these things were moved onto the LMS platforms, moved online, they're timed, they're having internet connectivity issues, and this idea of freezing. I also think of the students who might be tasked with creative assignments, like producing new works of art, and are freezing. And so it's so helpful for you to share those experiences with us, because it does have a lot of, I think, crossover with the kinds of assignments that we're giving in our courses. And I think the kind of reactions we all received throughout this period of moving into the remote environment. And one other thing that was a thread in your response was talking about the kind of physiological changes that happen when someone is undergoing trauma. And I was wondering if you might elaborate a little bit more on that point. What's happening in the brain in terms of learning for our students?
Yes, that's a great question. So when the brain encounters something uncertain, whether it is, do I belong here or not? Am I gonna get out of this car accident or not? Is my son safe to leave the house or not? Am I gonna pass the exam or not? Something uncertain that a lot is at stake, right? The brain is going to, as I mentioned earlier, search its toolbox. What can I do about this situation? When we don't have the answer, the brain keeps searching. And so, and what I mean by that is that the alarm system stays on. And so I was explaining to a student recently what that means. And I said, think about your computer, and your computer is trying to search something, and there is that circle that's going. And imagine if that circle's going and going and going. That's using a lot of energy, right? So when we're using a lot of energy, and if the alarm system is not turning off because we haven't resolved the questions, what happens is we become depleted of energy. So then the brain is going to prioritize. And what we know happens, the activity is going to increase, the neural activity will increase in the non-rational part of the brain stem and the limbic system. Those are two systems that are concerned with keeping us alive. So work is happening there. There is a lot of activities there. Well, that takes away from the rational, the prefrontal cortex, the cortical region. And so information on its way to the prefrontal cortex slows down. We know that when we're experiencing traumatic stress, trauma, toxic stress, morphologically, physiologically, electrically, chemically, things change in the brain. And they change in a way that makes us, again, be stuck in the non-rational part. Some scientists, some researcher, for example, Schenker and colleagues talk about limbic brakes. The limbic system is the emotional, and it puts a brake on, or it vetoes things from going to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where we make decisions, where we use our short-term memory, where all of our executive functions, empathy, and so on. And so it's not that the student is not trying. It's not that the student is not motivated. It's that reason is not working. When you work with a patient that has trauma and is stuck in this orbit of anxiety, therapists will tell the patient, don't try to reason. That part is not working. You're just going to try and fail, and you're going to feel even more exhausted, more depleted of energy. What we want to do is calm the nervous system down. It's scared. It's scared for its safety. So calm the nervous system down so we can begin to shift back to the balanced rational and non-rational components of the brain. So what does that mean, practically speaking? Practically speaking, we need to, practically speaking in the classroom, what does that mean? I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was teaching a genetics course, and a student waited for me after class and said, "Are we going to learn about evolution? Because I will drop the class if we do." Now, from the student's body language, I learned that this is a trigger. This is something that is not, that's stressful. And I said, "Well, tell me more." And I learned that the student grew up in a very religious environment and has a very, very, I would say, narrow understanding of what evolution is, and it very contradictory to her religious upbringing. And it's a source of, it's a trigger, right? Because it's questioning her entire framework. So I could have said, "Yeah, we are going to learn about it," and drop the class. But I thought I would be selling the student short if I did that. That would be the easy thing to do. What if I were to give the student options? What if I were to help the student see that this is an opportunity to learn about something that you could use to even inform, to go deeper into your religious beliefs? And I give options. So the students stayed in my class. And what I learned to do is either during the break or before the class or something, I reach out to the student and I say, "So I'm going to bring up the word evolution. And I want you to know that you could take a break, you could do these things, or you could interrogate the process, ask me questions." So fast forward to the end of the semester, the students stayed. Learn to engage with the material without letting it consume her with fear and anxiety. And this is going to be something really important, especially when we show images or present work that is likely going to trigger at least one person in the class.
I have definitely shown images that I could see in the classroom students were having a bit of a response to or shutting down. So not even necessarily like an overt kind of shock reaction or something like that, but just disengaging completely. There have definitely been conversations I've had about systemic racism, about a lack of representation in the art historical canon, that students I could see disengaging and thinking that, you know, they don't want any part of this conversation. And so taking a moment to frame this as, I think, again, it goes back to community. Like, we're still part of a community, and I want to challenge you to engage with this content in a way that is going to be beneficial to you. This is a helpful framework. So maybe we can return to that, because actually I'd love for us to look at an image together. Maybe we should do that now, since you brought up thinking about images, which is what we do. And so in the art history classroom, you know, I'm showing images that are engaging with difficult histories and presence as well, often. And sometimes it's problematic, I think, that many educators, many students can even read past some of the problematic content and focus on these narratives of beauty. Sometimes images are showing lots of violence towards women, but in ways that are canonically viewed as beautiful master works of art. And I think sometimes we don't take a step back and realize, could this be a trigger to some of our students? Should we frame this as difficult content? Many times, though, we're also looking at images that are structured such that they are intentionally evoking an emotional response. And so I would love your perspective on kind of, I'm thinking about this in two parts, and maybe we could start with part one, and then I'd love to share an image and move on to part two. But from your perspective, as educators asking our students to engage with images, what's happening in the brain when we're asking them to move between complicated discussions, complicated conversations, images, visual analysis, right? Thinking about reading, I think of the art history classroom is difficult in that we're asking them consistently to change these different modalities. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that. And then I would love to maybe more explicitly address these difficult images, or images that are evoking kind of difficult conversations or difficult histories.
Yeah. So trauma is about how the brain experiences the present moment. And how we experience the present moment has to do with our previous experiences. So um, we recall things. So information come into the brain, and part of the job of the brain is going to do comparison, right, of the information that I get to previous experience. And so we're very visual, and and to varying degree we have photographic memories. And so the senses then become a way, in this case the visual vision becomes a way to inform the experience of the now, right? So when I present an image, it's going to trigger something from my past. That's happening at a subconscious level because the brain is trying to make connection and make meaning. What does this mean, right? So we have to be really careful when, whether it is text, but especially images, what experience might we trigger in the students? Now, does that mean we don't teach? Does that mean I don't show the chapter on, for example, when I teach genetics, we talk about eugenics, right? Does that mean I don't know? Because history is really important. And so what can I do instead? I'm going to prepare the students. So I'm going to say, this is what's coming next. Here is why I am going to present that. It may cause you to feel this way. Here are some of the things you could do about it. How would you like me to help you? So I've presented information. I was transparent. I reminded the student, I am on your side. And then I said, you have options, right? So back to images, when I see a picture, whether it is a caricature or an actual video or an actual picture of combat, I notice in my body immediately, and I've been doing this work for a long time, but immediately there's tension. There's tension. I feel it in my stomach. My heart is constricted. And part of that is there's a lens through which I view the world. And it's my background as an immigrant from a war-torn country. Now, because of my experience, I've learned to say, okay, so I have this awareness. Now, what can I do about it? And there are days that I think I can't do this, right? I'm too fragile. This is going to trigger me. And then there are other days where I use that moment to educate and inform and also empower myself that I have a choice about this. A lot of our students don't have that. They don't have perhaps they're going to feel the trigger and the irritability and the anxiety, and it stays with them. They go home, they wake up the next day, and they don't know why they're feeling that way. So it's really important that we baby step with them through that process.
That is a point I actually never really deeply considered. That, I mean, when I think of the number of images that I am showing in a semester and all the potential variables that are there, it never really occurred to me that my lens does not equal everybody. I mean, I know that it's obvious when you say it, but I think in practice, sometimes we apply our lenses and don't necessarily remember that students are bringing their own lenses. And so I think when we're thinking about visual imagery in particular, this is really important, and thinking about employing content warnings where we think make the most sense, having open dialogues with our students, and again, reinforcing that idea of community, allowing for different options of engagement. Because I think that this is something the traditional art history classroom with the lights off and the projector doesn't usually allow for a lot of different options. It's everybody is focused on one image. And I think even many of us teaching remotely are doing something similar. We're recording our lectures, or we are meeting synchronously, and we have this image here. And so with your forgiveness, I'm about to do that. I'm going to share an image that the both of us can look at together. And I would love your thoughts
Yeah.
as an educator about how you might frame this image. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'm sharing with you an image by Francisco de Goya, 19th century Spanish painter. This is the 3rd of May in 1808. And it is a very well-known, very important painting that many of us teach in our introductory survey courses. And I'm going to just share with you all that I selected this because I would teach this image when I was teaching in high schools in an outreach program, or it was in their textbook. And the students actually, in large numbers, selected this image as an image that, one, they wanted to discuss, and two, they wanted to work on for their final projects. And I was really stunned. It's an image that's tied to Napoleonic history. This is the day after a group of Spaniards in Madrid rebelled against Napoleon's occupation and removal of King Charles IV. And here the French soldiers are just massacring these Spaniards. And so it's a, I think, a visceral image, it's a poignant image. It's also an image that is shown quite a lot. And so I wanted your thoughts, Maze. We could look at this together, any observations that you're struck by, or how you might frame this. I was puzzled at times in my own teaching with how students were interacting, if I was doing a very good job of really unpacking the historical weight, the emotive, weight here in this image, and not just kind of teaching it as this moment in the 19th century and kind of moving on.
Well, so the first thing that struck me when I saw this image is this right here. Look at how many men have their eyes covered, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is this, when do we do this? When do we cover our eyes? It is when we experience the trauma and we don't want to see it. It is when we experience something that is jolting to our entire being, that we just turn our face, we cover our eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I immediately felt that jolt, and there's the dead corpses on the ground, there is the blood, and also there is this sign of peace, sign of I surrender. But the Spaniards are outnumbered, and they are, you see how many men are holding their gun ready to shoot. So there is a power dynamic there that, for me, who has struggled with colonialism, and I see it, and it is not an empowering image, right? It may feel neutral for some students, but it's not going to feel neutral or not triggering for a lot of other students. And so, imagine that we present this in the class, and we present the historical context, but we don't dissect the trauma, the racism, the power dynamic, the colonialism. So what we do there is we normalize these things. we pacify them. Our silence is then can be traumatic for a subset of students, or it can send the message that this is okay. When the image themselves itself, in this case, this is a very powerful part of the image, where you see the men covering their eyes, and then we think we could just turn the next page and go on to the next image or the next lesson. But the reality is we can't take this back. It has registered in the students' minds. It has become part of their, right? And so what images did we send? Right? Our silence, so what I would do with this image that you said student picked is I would use it as an opportunity. First of all, I would preface it like I do when I talk about eugenics or cancer, or I say we're gonna see this image. This is the story behind this image. This is why I am going to show it. It may be triggering for some of you. You have the option to choose another image. If you choose to stay with this image, go in, look at where is the humanity in this image? Where is the lack of humanity in this story, right? So we could, then the student doesn't feel stuck. It's only them and the image. And so much rest on them engaging with this image. It's going to be on the exam. It's going to be part of this or that.
I like the way you're framing this because a few things. So one, I'm doing this inventory of where I am in the semester when I hit this chronologically. And often I'm in that space, as many of us are in, we have to rush through, we can't spend the time, we need to move on to the next image. And I think I take your points to heart here, that if we rush through a conversation about an image like this, and our narrative is, okay, it might be on the exam. This is a moment in 19th century painting. This is an important artist. Now I'm literally going to leave Spain, and now I'm going to move on to another chronologic or geographic area. What do we say about this massacre, about the power dynamics, about the people, about all that's loaded into this image? Just in terms of its subject matter and its historical context, not even to mention the pathos that is just like flowing from these figures. I love that you pointed to that gesture of the eyes being covered. I'm always so fixated on the figure who's doing that very Christ-like crucified pose, and it's been written about at length, and the students really get that, but it becomes a space of like, I identify this artist, I identify this moment, I identify this style, but I think many of us, for the best reasons, are saying maybe we don't want to talk about race in this image. Maybe we don't. If we talk about race in this image, are we potentially going to re-traumatize our students? I can't help when I look at this, but then to think about the images that have bombarded us through the Black Lives Matter movement, towards the contemporary violence towards Black bodies in the media. I mean, there's a direct resonance right now. And, I'm wondering if maybe you have some thoughts about, should instructors go there? And if they do, how do we do this? To go back to a point you made earlier, how do we do this in a way that's safe, that we're making sure that this conversation in this space is safe for our students?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not an art historian, but again, if I were teaching this, I would preface it, I would say everything I said, and then I would talk about what this image triggers in me, and why. I would talk about it as, it's not just a story that happened in the past. What can I learn from it? I talk about my experience and use it as a way to model to my students that, as Cornel West's, race matters, right? And the power differentials matter. and we could leverage history to build a better future. And then doing so, at the very least, first of all, lets my student know where I stand. It lets them know that I'm committed to I guess, paying attention to, witnessing, and also working towards racial justice. It also invites the students to view history in a different way, more than stories that happened in the past. And so what I'm doing is I'm not telling them this is what you should see in this image. I'm just talking very much about my experience. And then I could invite the students to talk about their experience of this image. Racism and racial violence, those topics are part of our lives. And they are things we can't just say, no, I'm not going to bring politics into the class. Showing this image is political, right? Yes. So, and also those issues are matters of the heart. On the one hand, I want to honor the fact that students we are on a learning journey. And on the other hand, I want to challenge the students and challenge them without dictating what they should and should not believe and see. And so what I'm going to do is invite to go into their experience. And how do I do that? Well, I preface it, this is going to be an image, etc. I give them options. And then I talk about my experience. I acknowledge the humanity of those who are surrendering, who are being murdered. I acknowledge the racism. I acknowledge the connection to the present moment. And I've also acknowledged, without overtly stating it, that there are students in the class who see themselves in this image.
Yeah.
Right? Who see themselves in that Christ figure who's surrendering and for me doing a piece. And so I acknowledge that. And for the students who don't see it, who this image appear very neutral to them, hopefully I've implanted some seeds of reflection.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the screen share. Thank you for indulging me, the art historian, and we have to look at an image. So thank you. And I appreciate you diving in to the visual analysis and to really looking together, which is what we do in our classroom. We look together. And so in a way, we kind of modeled what looking together could be, as opposed to a kind of very like linear discussion. And I know that many people don't do that, but the structure does allow for that. And I think particularly, it's complicated. I don't want to upset. I don't want to, make my students feel any discomfort. Also considering how difficult the times are. But I think the way that you framed what that does when we don't give that space is problematic and is, I think, I might not use this word correctly, but I think it could be re-traumatizing or triggering to the students who are seeing themselves in this image as well.
Absolutely. I mean, who are seeing themselves or seeing other human beings in those images. And what I mean by that is, okay, so I am, so there is the vicarious, there is a secondary trauma of witnessing your fellow human being. The George Floyd image was traumatizing to many people around the world who were not Black or African American. And part of that is because of how violent it is. Part of that is because of our shared humanity, because of the way the brain works. And so when we don't allow that space, we are re-traumatizing or traumatizing. This is what I meant by the trauma of the silence. Yeah.
That's very powerful.
because it leaves my brain doing this, searching. Does the teacher not recognize the racism within that image, or does the teacher not care to address it? Do I feel safe to raise my hand and talk about it? Do I feel, and we can't answer those, there's so much uncertainties that we present the students when we don't allow that space.
Thank you, Maze, for indulging me in moving through that image and talking a lot about different kinds of options and different ways that we could frame this. And I'm wondering, for those of us who might be thinking right now, I have a set curriculum I have to go through. Is this going to decrease the rigor of the course? Can I get them to pass the midterm if they're spending a lot of time on these kind of reflection spaces? Or I really can't shift from this set curriculum. This is what I teach. This is what they're going to be assessed. Do you have suggestions for instructors who might be feeling that way, or feeling like this kind of flexibility or creating these options might not work with the way they structure their course?
Yeah. So there are two aspects to this question. The first one is there's this myth of if trauma informed means you compromise the content or the rigor. And what trauma informed approach does is that it creates the environment where students have an optimal, we're increasing the capacity for learning. So we can challenge them. So we can notice, if we go back to my example of working with the student who was triggered by evolution, I didn't say, well, you don't need to, I'll give you a different assignment. No, I still covered evolution, but I gave options. I helped the student feel safe so I could challenge her with the concept of evolution. So there is that. So the other point is, it's important for the faculty member to themselves feel safe to be able to go into these topics of let's interrogate the race issue within this, let's interrogate the power, let's interrogate, right? If they don't feel safe for a variety of reasons, perhaps they are a faculty of color, perhaps they are a junior faculty and they feel like, what's going to happen if I don't do a good job?
Right.
Or then that's going to impact their ability to thrive in teaching this topic, right? They have to feel safe to be vulnerable, okay? They have to feel safe to make decisions about the curriculum. And let's be honest, in the academy, I think a lot of our colleagues, especially adjunct faculty members, perhaps don't have that leverage, don't feel empowered to say, you know what, I am going to change the curriculum in a way that I give this more time than this right here. So part of this trauma informed, it's not just trauma informed teaching, it's trauma informed education, where the faculty member feels empowered by the chair or the dean. Or so what I would say, for example, to a faculty member that says, I don't have time. I know this is important, but I don't have time. I say, all right, what can you do to still acknowledge it? Can you give the option of doing something online? Perhaps they could do a discussion. Perhaps they could do on a post-it note, they could write a reflection. Perhaps you can write your own reflection and post it online and say, this is my reflection. I invite you to, in the upcoming days, to continue to reflect on this image as it relates to the current moment with racial violence, with this or that. So what we don't want to do is completely ignore these issues, because that can be wounding to a lot of the students. Again, we leave them with the uncertainty of, why didn't the teacher bring this up? Do they not care? Do they not see it? And then what happens is then I start asking the question, do I belong in this space? Right? If the teacher doesn't see this issue as part of this image, and this issue happens to be impacting my community and my family.
And I think that I'm glad that you brought up kind of the different spaces where this could occur, this messaging can occur. It doesn't necessarily need to take up class time in a lecture. Maybe you can acknowledge, allude to it, and it lives in a discussion board, or it's somewhere else and activates the whole kind of space of the classroom, the virtual classroom. Or we can use these virtual spaces when we're back in person, or for those of you who are in person already. I think this is a really important takeaway, that we should think about our instructor presence and our instructor voice as permeating through all of those spaces as well. So it goes back again to that key concept of community. And I wanted to return to a point we addressed much earlier in our conversation, which is also thinking about the ways that maybe communal looking or thinking together about difficult content or coming together as a class could be activated to be restorative, could be activated to encourage kind of hope. And I'm always so happy when I read your pieces in Inside Higher Ed that you're calling on your philosophy background. And it's so clear to me that you're always thinking about humanity and the human piece of all this at the core. And so I welcome you to comment on how we might think as art educators about using this communal space of looking together, of discussing together, to also be restorative in this.
So, I wrote that article back in March called Hope Matters. And it was written to invite educators to impart optimism to their students. And it was written I wrote it thinking that we would be over the pandemic by the fall. And what happened is, no, we're still enduring its ugliness. And so I will be very honest, during the summer, I had moments and days where I could even envision like trying to grasp, to hold on to hope, and it was difficult. And part of that is the community, as you said, right? There wasn't that community that reinforces our sense of, our sense of meaning and purpose. So what I want to say is that hope is important. Hope is critical. Hope is the word for hope in the Arabic language. Amal comes from the same root as the word for pain, alam, and it's just switching the words. And so in order for us to really use hope, we have to acknowledge the pain. We have to really negotiate with that pain. And it's messy. It's still ongoing. When we grieve, it's really working with that pain. And when we grieve in silence, in isolation, it's so much more paralyzing. When we grieve in community to negotiate with that pain, there is a sense of power that we can feel, and it's coming from the community. So what I'm trying to say is that it is important to leverage that power of the community to walk through the grief, and also to start to interrogate this notion of hope beyond the linguistic meaning. Mm-hmm. What does it mean in action? What does it mean to transcend hope when we are in the midst of adversities? What I do is I use poetry a lot. That's what works for me. Poetry that is almost presents the contradiction of the despair and the hope, the unknown and the future. Um, and and what I see it does, it allows me to grieve, to cry, and it also allows me to wonder. And so I think that contradictions for me, honoring both sides, helps me heal. It's so much more powerful when I bring that poem and I say, let's talk about it. Let's interrogate it. Because your experience of that poem, when I see that, oh, it is also making you cry and smile, it reinforces my experience.
Mhm.
And that reinforcement, one of the things it does is, oh, there is a connection, right? When I look and I smile and we are far from each other, the brain can still feel that connection and it helps me calm down. It helps me feel less, I am all alone, but I am in community. How do we leverage that community? The art is so important. The brain loves creativity. The brain loves stories. The brain loves colors. And so let us make stories, make art, make disrupt the canonical narrative, if you will, of content and rigor and and competition and the individual over the community, the care, the well-being, the beauty, right? I think the teachers have such a powerful role in forging that path of community-centered education.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more, and I couldn't say it any better. So I will say that when we all switched to remote teaching, it was a joy to hear from my students as we were learning together and looking together. It was this moment of um, kind of normalcy and community and collaboration and just this complete opposite of this isolation that so many of us are facing. I know I'm facing, and so I think it's a good place to end our conversation and thinking about this is very heavy content, and we want to do our best to handle this responsibly. But also part of our role is to guide our classes together as a community, and nothing has more power to bring people together than the arts. So so we're all in a wonderful place to think about this. So Maze, thank you so much for really cementing our conversation around trauma, telling us a lot about what's actually happening to our students right now physiologically, things that I'm sure we've all encountered, but are now all the more empowered to help support and accommodate as we move forward, because the trauma of this moment is not ending immediately or anytime soon. And so this is a really important conversation. So thank you so much again for your time and for lending your expertise. And
Thank you. I'm very grateful to have had this space and conversation with you.
thank you.